we anticipate a total revenue of 4.6 trillion pesos, representing 16.2% of the country's gross domestic product. Is this correct, Madam Sponsor?
That is correct, Madam Speaker, Your Honor.
Thank you, Madam Sponsor. Thank you, Madam Speaker. With a proposed national budget of 6.3 trillion pesos for 2025, how does the government plan to bridge the resulting deficit?
Madam Speaker, para sa taong 2025, ang inaasahang deficit na amounting to 1.537 trillion ay ma-finance through gross borrowings amounting to 2.545 trillion.
In other words, dito sa 6.3 trillion pesos budget, magkano ang manggagaling sa pangungutang?
So, Madam Speaker, as I had mentioned, so for a total spending of 6.352 trillion and with a projected revenues of 4.644 trillion, the deficit amounting to 1.537, ang estimated po natin na gross borrowings would be 2.545 trillion, Madam Speaker.
So magkano?
Ang gross borrowings, as I had mentioned, is 2.545 trillion.
545 trillion. Ito ang gross borrowings na kasama rito sa national budget?
Yes, for 2025.
Guests, magandang umaga po sa inyong lahat. I stand before you today not just as a public servant, but as a fellow Filipino, fully aware of the daily challenges our people face. The high cost of basic needs, especially rice and electricity charges, to unforeseen events such as illness, death, and job loss that can easily push a family to worsening degrees of poverty, or for a family to become poor even when not poor. Sa amin po sa Marikina, ang simpleng ulan ay maaaring magdulot ng matinding baha. Kaya't para sa amin at sa nakararami ang palaisipan, kailan kaya tuluyan nang mawawala ang baha sa buhay namin. When it rains, fear grips us. When will a solution to these recurring challenges finally come? We have concluded the budget hearings for each agency, and what stands clear is the vital role of accountability and transparency. The funds entrusted by Congress are not just figures in a ledger. They are meant to uplift lives and create real, lasting improvements for every Filipino. Kaya't malaga na busisihin ang bawat piso sa budget. Malamang ito ang point of view ng ating mga kababayan habang sinusuri natin ang pambansang budget. This morning, we will discuss and debate the general principles on which the 2025 General Appropriations Bill was crafted, the macroeconomic assumptions, and the targets that we hope to achieve. Adopted by Congress in 2022, our medium-term fiscal framework, which articulates our multi-year economic targets, is built on robust macroeconomic principles, carefully calibrated to address both domestic and global challenges. We are navigating towards sustained and inclusive growth while ensuring fiscal consolidation remains a priority. Yes, our economy is growing today. Our GDP expanded by 6.3% in the first half of the year, putting us on track to meet our growth target of 6 to 7%. This reflects sound fiscal management and responsible governance. The numbers show that we are on the right path. Through our collective efforts, we have brought inflation down to 3.3% as of August 2024. However, the work is far from over. Year to date, the inflation rate stands at 3.6%, which is 32% lower than the 5.3% year-to-date inflation rate from last year. On employment, the numbers tell a hopeful story. The unemployment rate has dropped to 4.7% in July from 4.9% last year. In 2024, wage and salaried workers increased by 907,000. Just in July, we saw an additional 221,000 compared to the same month last year. This is a clear sign that more Filipinos are finding higher quality jobs and that our efforts to create meaningful employment are making a real difference. This budget that we are proposing is a piece of the roadmap for growth, sustainable and inclusive development. It contains the various programs of government created to address problems that have emerged over time. Kaya't sa madaling salita, ang 2025 General Appropriations Bill ay isang libro ng mga solusyon sa bawat problemang hinaharap ng pamilyang Pilipino. The proposed 6.352 trillion peso budget for fiscal year 2025 is more than just a set of allocations. It reflects our commitment to improving the lives of every Filipino. At the forefront is education, with a proposed allocation of 977.6 billion pesos, recognizing that the future strength of our nation lies in the hands of our youth. Through these investments, we aim to equip them with the skills needed to meet tomorrow's challenges. Healthcare is set to receive 297.6 billion pesos to ensure that every Filipino has access to quality medical services. By proposing to strengthen PhilHealth and upgrade our hospitals, we are laying the groundwork for a healthier, more productive population. Ang 211.3 billion pesos para sa agrikultura ay para matiyak ang seguridad sa pagkain. Sa pamamagitan ng pagbibigay lakas sa ating mga magsasaka, tinitiyak natin na may sapat at abot-kayang pagkain ang bawat Pilipino. Sa taong 2025, nakalaan ang 253.378 billion pesos para sa ayuda na naglalayong magbigay ng suporta sa mga pinaka-nangangailangan sa ating lipunan. Ang tulong na ito ay mahalaga upang matulungan ang mga pamilya sa pagharap sa mga hamon tulad ng sakit at sakuna na nagdudulot ng matinding hirap na talagang nakakapagpanglumo. Ito ay tulong na magbibigay daan sa kanilang pagbangon at magtitiyak ng tuloy-tuloy na pag-unlad ng pamilyang Pilipino. Narito tayo ngayon hindi para magturuan, kundi para tiyakin na ang budget na ating tatalakayin ay magsisilbing gabay tungo sa mas maliwanag na kinabukasan. Isang budget na magbibigay ng tiwala sa bawat Pilipino na ang pamahalaan ay tapat na naglilingkod para sa kanilang kapakanan. Ang budget na ito ay hindi lamang mga numero. Ito ay plano para matiyak na ang bawat piso ay magagamit ng tama at mararamdaman ng bawat Pilipino, lalo na ng mga pinaka-nangangailangan. Sama-sama natin isusulong ang budget na magbibigay ng pag-asa at kaunlaran. Tiwala ako na ang ating talakayan ay magiging masinop at malalim batay sa ating tungkulin na tiyakin na ang bawat piso ay tunay na magsisilbi sa kapakanan ng lahat. Maraming salamat at mabuhay ang Pilipinas. Madam Speaker, we may now proceed with the debate on the general principles of the 2025 national budget.
Madam Sponsor, for clearly outlining the principles and provisions adopted in drafting the 2025 national budget. Sorry. Madam Speaker, the proposed 2025 national budget stands at 6.3 trillion pesos, representing 21% of the country's gross domestic product. This marks a significant 10% increase from the 2024 national budget of 5.768 trillion pesos, reflecting the government's commitment to accelerate economic growth and addressing pressing national priorities. The budget is geared toward supporting the administration's goals of economic and social transformation by prioritizing key sectors such as education, healthcare, social services, public infrastructure, agriculture, and other vital areas. Madam Speaker and Madam Sponsor, while the goals of the 2025 proposed national budget are clear and focused on driving economic and social growth, significant challenges remain in effectively implementing them. As the national budget steadily increases, the country's revenue growth has struggled to keep pace, resulting in a widening fiscal deficit. This growing gap between expenditure and revenue raises concerns about the sustainability of government spending and the ability to fund essential programs without resorting to excessive borrowings. Despite progress, Madam Speaker, as the country slowly inches toward recovery 2 years after the pandemic, the lingering impact on the economy is still evident in the lives of millions of Filipino families. Many continue to struggle with financial insecurity, poverty, and rising costs of living, even as the national budget continues to expand each year. Madam Speaker, Madam Sponsor, this disconnect between the budget growth and improved living conditions underscores the need for more targeted resource allocations and efficient program execution to ensure that economic recovery leads to tangible benefits for all Filipinos. Vigilant and thorough scrutiny of the proposed national budget is essential to promote fiscal responsibility and maximize the impact of public spending. Madam Speaker, Madam Sponsor, it is important that we remain vigilant and thorough in scrutinizing the proposed national budget for 2025. Madam Speaker, Madam Sponsor, for the 2025 fiscal program, we anticipate a total revenue of 4.6 trillion pesos, representing 16.2% of the country's gross domestic product. Is this correct, Madam Sponsor?
That is correct, Madam Speaker, Your Honor.
Thank you, Madam Sponsor. Thank you, Madam Speaker. With a proposed national budget of 6.3 trillion pesos for 2025, how does the government plan to bridge the resulting deficit?
Madam Speaker, para sa taong 2025, ang inaasahang deficit na amounting to 1.537 trillion ay ma-finance through gross borrowings amounting to 2.545 trillion.
Madam Speaker, Madam Sponsor, in other words, dito sa 6.3 trillion pesos budget, magkano ang manggagaling sa pangungutang?
So, Madam Speaker, as I had mentioned, for a total spending of 6.352 trillion and with a projected revenues of 4.644 trillion, the deficit amounting to 1.537, ang estimated po natin na gross borrowings would be 2.545 trillion. So if we deduct from that amortization and net financing, ang amount po niyan is exactly equal to the estimated deficit, Madam Speaker.
So magkano?
Ang gross borrowings, as I had mentioned, is 2.545 trillion.
5 trillion. Ito ang gross borrowings na kasama rito sa national budget.
Yes, for 2025.
Madam Speaker, Madam Sponsor, what is the total national debt as of now?
Sa ngayon po, ang total is about 16 trillion.
16 trillion pesos?
15.69 trillion to be exact. Madam
Okay,
Speaker.
so we now have, Madam Speaker, a total debt of 15.6 trillion pesos. Just a year ago, this was, I think, 14 trillion pesos. Correct me if I'm wrong, Madam Sponsor.
That is correct, Madam Speaker, Your Honor.
So, Madam Speaker, Madam Sponsor, what specific measures or strategies will the government implement to address the shortfalls?
Madam Speaker, Your Honor, ang pinaka-importante pagdating sa utang ay ang tinatawag na debt to GDP ratio. Ibig sabihin, hindi yung absolute amount ng utang, kung hindi yung relative amount ng utang. Ibig sabihin, kung gaano kalaki ang utang kumpara sa kabuoang kita ng ekonomiya. So today, our debt to GDP ratio is 60.9%. At sa ngayon, tayo naman po, itong debt to GDP ratio ay manageable po. At as of now, tayo naman po ay on track to our target of 56.3 na
Madam
debt
Speaker.
to GDP ratio by 2028. So ang ibig sabihin, Madam Speaker, ang ating pag-manage ng utang is really sa pagpapalaki ng kita. So in other words, kailangan pag umutang tayo, kailangan maging productive ang paggamit ng utang. So kailangan pinapalaki natin ang ating kita para mabayaran natin ang ating utang. So in other words, debt to GDP, yung GDP nasa denominator, hindi po ba? So habang pinapalaki natin ang ating GDP, pinapalaki natin ang denominator, ay napapababa natin ang debt to GDP over time. Madam Speaker, Your Honor.
Madam Speaker, Madam Sponsor, what is the debt to GDP ratio? I was not able to,
Madam Speaker, currently it is 60.9.
not 56.3%?
56.3 is our target for 2028, Madam Speaker. And as we are progressing, we are on track, Madam Speaker, Your Honor.
So the debt to GDP ratio is actually 60%.
As of the moment, Madam Speaker.
60%. And the target, Madam Speaker, is 56.3%, which is still above the pre-pandemic levels. Madam Speaker, Madam Sponsor, is this correct?
Tama po yun. Pero, Madam Speaker, Your Honor, siyempre, sa buong mundo, nagsilakihan, lumobo talaga ang utang ng buong mundo dahil sa pandemya. Kinailangan talaga ng lahat ng bansa sa buong mundo na umutang just to be able to cope with the needs of something that is very extraordinary. Ito pong COVID pandemic.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Speaker, Madam Sponsor. The country's target revenue as a percentage of GDP has remained relatively stagnant based on the records, prompting concerns about the efficacy of existing revenue-generating strategies. Madam Speaker, Madam Sponsor, what specific reforms or initiatives does the government plan to implement or improve this revenue collection process?
Sa ngayon po, of course, ang pinaka-importante sa lahat ay ang pag-i-improve ng tax administration. So yan ang pinaka-importante. Meron tayong pinasa na ease of paying taxes noong January 5, 2024. At ito naman po ay nag-modernize ng ating tax administration at nag-improve ng ating collection efficiency. So, ang ginawa po nito ay na-simplify po ang ilang mga tax processes at nakapag-provide po ng mga facilities nang sa ganon ay napagpadali ang pagbayad po ng buwis ng ating mga kababayan, particularly through electronic channels. At kasama din dito yung ating digital VAT. Actually, ang digital VAT, Madam Speaker, Your Honor, hindi naman po ito bagong buwis dahil ito ay lumang VAT, kaya lang hindi natin nakolekta So nung pinasa natin itong bagong batas, it really was just a way to collect itong VAT sa mga digital platforms.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. Thank you, Madam Sponsor. According to the Philippine Statistics Authority, the unemployment rate reached its lowest at 3.1% as of June 2024. Is this correct, Madam Speaker, Madam Sponsor?
That is correct, Madam Speaker, Your Honor.
So, the unemployment rate as of now is 3.1%, a rather low
That is
figure.
correct, Madam Speaker, Your Honor.
And the underemployment also declined to 12.1% from 12.3% in 2023. Is this correct, Madam Speaker, Madam Sponsor?
That is correct, Madam Speaker, Your Honor.
So these are very good indicators. However, Madam Speaker, Madam Sponsor, despite these improvements, 58% of Filipino families, or around 16 million households, still consider themselves poor. Madam Speaker, Madam Sponsor, so what happened?
Madam Speaker, Your Honor, ang maganda sigurong tingnan ay ang pagbaba ng poverty incidence. So, maaaring tama po ang ating kagalang-galang na Congressman Kong Bordado na marami pa rin sa ating mga kababayan na mahirap pa rin. Pero kahit paano naman po, dahil sa pagganda ng ating employment figures, ay nagkaroon tayo ng improvement sa ating poverty incidence. So sa katunayan, ang ating poverty incidence ay bumaba from poverty incidence dropped from 18.1 in 2021 to 15.5 in 2023. So, yun siguro ang magandang tingnan, and that would be consistent with the gains that we're seeing in terms of employment, Madam Speaker, Your Honor.
So the poverty incidence drastically declined, Madam Speaker, Madam Sponsor, from 18.1% in 2021 to 15.5% in 2023.
That is correct.
Thank you, Madam Sponsor. Thank you, Madam Speaker.